ESS, Environmental Value Systems Part 2, will examine the environmental value systems of different world cultures. I will present contrasting environmental value systems so that you understand that cultures have different environmental values. I will expand on the differences in decisions made by contrasting environmental value systems in Part 3. The significant idea here is that there is a wide spectrum of environmental value systems, each with its own premises and implications. This movie provides a small window on different cultural perspectives that would shape an environmental value system. What's presented here is quite superficial, but will help give you some sense that cultural attitudes toward the environment do differ. I will look at the following cultural attitudes of Native Americans, Judeo-Christian European culture, capitalism, and Buddhism, and at the very end, as an add-on, we'll look at Gaia. I'll start with Native American culture, indigenous tribe culture. In traditional Native American culture, one did not own property. The property was held in common. Living was subsistence, taking only what one needed on a short-term basis. There was low resource use, restraint, low levels of materialism. The land, plants, and animals had spirituality. There was a respect for nature. As a whole, Native American oral tradition captured the cultural ideals, which included a reverence for nature. Native American culture held that people belonged to the earth, not that the earth belonged to people. Native American values held that nature is the location of spirituality, both the individual and, in a more general sense, of the sacred. Its spiritual value calls for reverence, respect, and humility in the relationship with nature. When you come to know nature is when you become one with our living world, one life, one world, one sky. Notice the reference here to Lakota wisdom, the intersection of culture and the environment. Chief Seattle wrote, "The earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons and daughters of the earth. This we know, all things are connected. Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves." Wiyaka Numpa wrote, "The red earth is the dust of our ancestors' bones, and her righteousness is perpetuated by our integrity, reverence, and respect." Tony Tenfingers of the Lakota tribe wrote, "As you develop your awareness in nature, you begin to see how we influence all life and how all life influences us." A Native American saying goes, "Only when the last tree has been cut down, the last fish caught, and the last river poisoned, will we realize that we cannot eat money." The kiva, circular structures, seen here in this photograph of an ancient Native American site known as Mesa Verde, is where groups met to make consensus decisions. Within the Native American worldview, the economic system was bartering for goods rather than using money, that nature provides all that one could need, that there was low waste. The political system was use of consensus when making decisions. Laws were handed down in an oral tradition. The religious system, polytheistic. Animals and plants had spirituality. And in terms of technology, the technology use was generally of low impact. Here's an image of a sign announcing a sacred site for Aboriginal peoples in Australia. Notice the large penalty for unlawful entry. In terms of Native American land use, you say that I use the land, and I reply, yes, it is true. But it is not the first truth. The first truth is that I love the land. I see that it is beautiful. I delight in it. I am alive in it. But with every analysis of culture, we must be careful about oversimplifying or generalizing or romanticizing. Not everything about Native American culture was perfectly ecocentric. Paleo-Indians probably helped cause the extinction of large mammals in North America. And in terms of resource management, Native Americans were not always passive in the wilderness, since they used fire to burn prairies in order to increase crop productivity. Native Americans were not always passive in the wilderness as they hunted and used fire to burn prairies in order to increase productivity. Now let's look at Judeo-Christian culture found in the US and Europe, leading to capitalist socio-political structure. Remember to be thinking carefully of the intersection of culture and the environment. The Bible was a guiding document for Judeo-Christian settlers in the Americas, and the language of the Bible suggested a different approach toward the environment. God commanded, "Replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over it." God said, "Let us make man in our image, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds in the air, and over the livestock." The settlers in the Americas were Europeans, and they were explorers and set about establishing colonies around the globe. These adventurers, conquerors, replaced Native American tribes. They owned land and viewed species as there for the taking, an unlimited resource base. Settlers moved across the Americas from east to west, replacing Native American tribes through their use of technology, guns and railroad, as well as land ownership. Here's an image of farms in the 1700s, early 1800s in the United States. There was subdivision of the land, ownership of the land, management of the land. In this image, you can see huge trees that would have been spectacularly beautiful in their original forest. These trees have been cut, and they're being moved to distant locations. The culture had a separation of spirit, the soul, and the body, matter. God commanded, "Replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over it." The Judeo-Christian settlers worked to conquer the wilderness by clearing out forests to make living space and provide wood for shelters, and clearing forests to grow food. The European mind saw an empty land that offered incredible abundance. The killing of wild animals provided food. Large numbers of animals were killed. The American bison was nearly wiped out by overhunting. In these images, you can see the management of the land. You can see how the land was divided by ownership. In this culture, consumption is high. The impact of technology is high. The land is subdivided into legal entities administrated by a distant government. You can see that the land is highly managed. The European pioneers were anthropocentrists toward technocentrists. They were often cornucopian in their thinking. A cornucopian is a futurist who believes that continued progress and provision of material items can be met by a similar continuation in technological, political, or scientific advances. And with time, there was a separation from nature. Do you know where your food comes from? So the European explorer, pioneer, colonist leads us to capitalism and the intersection of capitalism and the environment. In capitalist societies, economic growth is put above all other factors, and in many cases, this growth comes at the expense of the environment. Consider capitalism in the US or elsewhere in the world, a free market economy where value is placed on decisions that make economic sense. Technology exists to manage pollution, but only if it makes economic sense. Is continued growth really possible? Are resources infinite? Is the corporate sector mostly to blame for environmental degradation in the more economically developed countries? Or is it the consumer that is negligent of the environment? People in the US consume 1,500 plastic bottles per second. In modern Western economies, nature is considered capital. The forest is natural capital that provides a good called lumber. Notice the economic language around beautiful trees. The cattle farm represents natural capital that provides a good called meat. Do the cattle have intrinsic value? Do they have the right to exist without having to provide food for people at the cost of their lives? And lastly, let's consider Buddhism. How do cultures with a history of Buddhism intersect with the environment? Buddhist values include living creatures that depend on each other, that humans are not above other creatures, and that compassion is extended to all species. Buddhist views include to live in harmony with nature. The Buddha was seen as the protector of all beings. The Buddha saw beings in the universe as equal in nature, and the lives of all humans and animals were interrelated, mutually developing, and inseparable. Lastly, as an extension, let's look at Gaia. If one were to view the world in the most holistic way possible, it would be to view the Earth as Gaia. The concept of Gaia was put forward by James Lovelock in the late 1970s. The Gaia hypothesis suggests that the Earth is a self-regulating, complex system in which feedback mechanisms maintain equilibrium. Lovelock wrote, "I see the Earth and the life it bears as a system that has the capacity to regulate the temperature and the composition of the Earth's surface and to keep it comfortable for living organisms. The self-regulation of the system is an active process driven by the free energy available from the sunlight." Lovelock was an astrophysicist, and he arrived at the Gaia concept by comparing the atmospheric composition of the Earth with other planets. He noticed that the Earth was the only planet that had not developed an atmosphere mostly composed of carbon dioxide. He attributed the difference in atmospheric gases on Earth relative to the other planets to the presence of living organisms here on Earth. Lovelock wrote that all living things, the biota, influence their abiotic environment, and that environment in turn influences the biota. Lovelock wrote, "To me, it was obvious that the Earth was alive in the sense that it was a self-organizing, self-regulating system." A prominent supporter of Lovelock's Gaia concept was Lynn Margulis, who, along with many, did not see the Earth as a living organism. She wrote, "Gaia is not an organism, but an emergent property of interaction among organisms. Gaia is the series of interacting ecosystems that compose a single huge ecosystem at the Earth's surface." We can take a global perspective on resource use, and the strengths of a global perspective are: sustainable management means ensuring resources are not degraded, that there's equilibrium, that there's self-regulation that needs to be maintained for stability over the long term. The global perspective is useful because many problems have global consequences. One of the strengths is understanding that our actions can have a global impact, and that might prompt societies to think about impacts on different generations over time. Sometimes problems need international agreements. Again, another strength of a global perspective. Ecosystems are affected by global processes, the water cycle or the atmospheric system. The global perspective stresses the interrelationships between systems. The weaknesses of a global perspective on resource use would be that ecosystems can exist at many scales, and so a more local perspective is sometimes appropriate. Human actions can be culturally specific, traditional farming methods by way of example. Often local methods have evolved to be more sustainable for the local environment. Individual or small-scale community action can be very effective for managing resources sustainably. For example, recycling. That some environmental problems are local in nature. Urban smog, by way of example. And that brings us to the end of IBESS Environmental Values, Part 2. Part 3 will explore more deeply environmental decisions within the context of ecocentric, anthropocentric, and technocentric environmental values systems.